Hello, welcome. I'm Louis Marvin. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a project coordinator from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. We're really excited that you're all here today and that our presenters from MenHealing and the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center are here. In a minute, I'll turn it over to them to do a fuller introduction. But for now, I just want to say a couple things. One, as you probably know from Zoom, this webinar is being recorded, and all of the sessions in this series, which are going to be 6 sessions, will be recorded in English and Spanish and made available on our website. So a lot of people have asked questions about that. If you have a colleague who thought that maybe they had to come to all the sessions in order to participate in any of them, you can let them know that they can hop in at any point and they'll be able to check those recordings. We'd love to see you at all of them if you're available, but that's not required. And closed captioning is available today. You can turn that on in the captions option in the Zoom menu. We're offering live Spanish interpretation. Again, if you've joined since I've said this, make sure to select a language, either English or Spanish, using the globe icon there. Yeah, besides that, I just want to say you can use the chat for responding to the prompts from the presenters. But if you have questions, please use the Q&A, and the last 30 minutes of today's session will be dedicated to answering those questions. That's all my housekeeping for now. I think I hit everything, and I'll turn it over to Kenton, Jim, and Sharon. Thanks for being here, you all.
Thank you, Louis. Greetings, everyone. My name is Kenton Kirby. I use he, him pronouns, and I am from MenHealing, and I'm based here in Brooklyn, New York. And it's a very snowy day here, but today we're going to be talking about understanding and supporting men who experience sexual harm. And I'm lucky enough to be here with my great colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves. So maybe Jim, you can introduce yourself, and then we go to Sharon.
Great. Thank you, Kenton. This is Jim Struve, he, him pronouns. I am the executive director of MenHealing, and I live in Bellingham, Washington, which is north of Seattle, right close to the Canadian border. I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Sharon Imparato. I use the she, her pronouns. I am the project director of clinical training and technical assistance at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, also known as BARC. And I'm also very lucky to be a staff member of MenHealing and get to work very closely with Jim and Kenton. And I am joining you from both snowy, rainy Boston. Back to you, Kenton.
Thank you, Sharon and Jim. Yeah, so obviously this is a joint session between MenHealing and BARC. We've done a lot of collaborative work together over the years. And so we're gonna, we want to be mindful of time and get to the content. So throughout this presentation, we are gonna have some interactive prompts. We want to definitely, as Louis mentioned, use the chat for that, and any questions, please use the Q&A and we'll try to address those throughout the training, but definitely the last half hour that we're all together. So I want to welcome you all here. And yeah, hold on, I don't have my slide. Sometimes my slides don't work right. So the goal of today, we're going to talk about how men are survivors, recognizing men as survivors, and some of the biases that happen in order to promote open and safe spaces for men, for them to share their experiences of sexual harm and receive support. We also know that sexual violence is not done in a vacuum. It's not just about the incident itself. What contributes to the choose to commit sexual violence, and what makes it difficult for men to understand themselves as victims and disclose. We know that we're going to talk about some of the myths and the facts. We will spend time on the facts, recognizing you probably have the skills. We all are consciously skilled, but what gives in the way of you possibly recognizing that or using those biases in our work? Unintentionally or intentionally, whatever, we still move in our own biases. And also, our response has a huge ripple effect on someone's healing process, how we respond to them and their experience based on the different levels of communication, verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal communication. and how a bad response can shut people down. And also for men, average time between experiences and disclosure is 20 years. So we also have to be mindful of that kind of how we have to like engage folks. Whereas big thing with sexual survivors is shame, and we want to not shame folks or and also be mindful of our own stigmas that go along with our work. All right. So you're all going to learn the facts and dynamics of sexual harm. And also, what I mentioned earlier, we're going to explore personal biases about men being victims. And the purpose is to dismantle those barriers to support. We're also going to talk about some strategies that we use here at MenHealing and Bark to create environments where men can feel comfortable, ask for support. And throughout this session, we're going to be checking in a little bit about our bodies. So much of our work is actually tapping into our bodies and our body's response to things that we experience, the men that we get to work with, they experience. And so it's really important for us. We're going to be checking in throughout the time how we're physically reacting to what we're hearing. So I think we're going to pass it over to Sharon.
Thank you, Kenton. You can go ahead and click through.
Okay.
We've introduced ourselves as the presenters, and I see folks are already introducing themselves in the chat, which is wonderful. So you're already steps ahead. But if people would like to share, I encourage you to share. And here's just a few things that you're welcome to share in the chat if you would like. Your name, pronoun, identities you'd want acknowledged in this space, and anything else you would like to share. So again, please continue to share. We have 142 participants, so we are not going to read the introductions, but I do encourage you to take a look to see who we're in community with in these trainings. We've got folks from family services, domestic and sexual violence programs. You've got advocates from all over. So thank you so much for being here. One of the things we do is talk about identities that you want acknowledged in this space, and we are going to have a whole webinar session on that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that the identities that we hold impact how we see others and how others see us. The identities that survivors hold impact how they see themselves, how they see others, how we see them. And so I think it's just really important to begin to acknowledge that intersection. And the biggest intersection around identities that we're going to be going through this webinar series is seeing men as survivors. Again, only 2 identities and many identities, but what does that mean for us? How does that impact how we see the survivors that we work with, if again, they are a man? And how do we help men to recognize that they can both be a man and a survivor? Next slide, please. So I'm going to just have everyone pause for a second on the introductions. We can continue this after, because we're going to just have a point of reflection. And I'd like folks to share in the chat if you would like to. You don't have to. It's always an option. But I have a question for everyone to answer if they're willing. And Ken, if you don't mind clicking. The question is, what do you think is your role when understanding and supporting survivors of sexual harm? Again, what do you think is your role when understanding and supporting survivors of sexual harm? Listen.
Yes.
Listen, believe, listen, empower, validate, advocate, believe. To listen. I'm seeing a lot of listening. I'm seeing a lot of validating.
I saw witness, Sharon.
Witness. Thank you.
Yeah.
Empathy. A lot of witness. Survivor centered. Amazing. So Kenton and Jim, I think our work here is done.
Yeah, let's go home. Well, we're already home.
Everyone knows what their roles are. But I will say the top 2 reasons why most survivors of sexual violence do not come forward is not being believed and being judged. So it is very important to listen, to witness, to believe, and to be non-judgmental. So the next question is just a question for you to reflect on in quiet with yourself. But I want you to ask yourself, does this role change if the survivor is a man? Again, does this role change if the survivor is a man? Absolutely not.
Absolutely
No,
not. Yeah, no,
absolutely not. No. What I do want to point out, and I think it's important, and we are going to talk about this throughout the webinar series, is our roles don't change, but we might. it's really important for us to be aware of what changes for us if the survivor we are talking to doesn't match what we quote unquote stereotypically think a survivor looks like. Again, if a man was to sit in front of you, what would happen? What bias might come up for you that would keep you from being able to use the skills that you already have? So I just want to leave you with that and pass it off to Jim.
Thank you, Sharon. This is Jim, he, him pronouns. Kenton, the next slide, please. Once we get ourselves centered in terms of who we are and what our role is, then we move on to identifying the population of survivors that we're addressing and talking about here today. And it's important that we focus on our language and the definitions. So let's take just a minute here and talk about what we're meaning when we talk about men survivors. We're talking about man, boy, young man. And it's clear that we're not necessarily talking about body parts. Body parts are not the same as gender. And so let's talk for our purposes here with this presentation. Men survivors include anyone who sees or identifies themselves as a man. And let's dive in just a little bit deeper. Cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. By transgender, we're referring to people who have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from their sex assigned at birth. And non-conforming refers to people who don't follow other people's ideas or stereotypes about how they should look or act based on the binary of female or male sex they're assigned at birth. We're not going to be in this series, in this presentation, particularly comparing and contrasting populations of survivors in their experience, but we're wanting to talk specifically about the experiences of men as survivors. Another important factor to help us focus in, because it's not always assumed, we so frequently, when we think of sexual violence, sexual trauma, sexual abuse, the umbrella that we're using is sexual harm. We'll talk about in a second more of the definition of what we mean. And it's important to know that sexual harm can be an experience of childhood, can be an experience that happens in adulthood, or both. Next slide, please. And let me just back up 1 second and mention that people who do have abuse, harm, victimization during childhood are at higher risk for being victimized or experiencing sexual harm later again in life. People, men who have had sexual harm during childhood, spend a lot of time in their survival and recovery finding a place to belong, to feel safe, or to get away, because sexual harm for men is so invisible still. And it's not uncommon. Places like military associations or organizations that are affiliated for men or male identity become places where survivors might be drawn. It's important to know that there is a higher likelihood of sexual harm that may occur even in places like the military or individuals who are incarcerated. So what we're talking about here, there's a definition from an organization in New Zealand that really resonates for us in terms of sexual harm. When someone has a sexual experience they don't want, or are forced into any kind of sexual act by another person, they've expressed sexual harm, experienced sexual harm. And For men, for males, for boys, a lot of times the person who's the recipient of that sexual harm does not code it or describe it or talk about it as violence or trauma. That's why sexual harm is more appropriate for us to focus in. It's the harm rather than the interpretation of what you make of that. Next slide, please. And it's important to know that within this umbrella of the terminology for sexual harm, it can happen in a lot of different ways. Sexual harm might involve physical contact, or it could even be experienced through online interactions. It might happen once. It might be chronic. It might be sustained over a long period of time. And it might involve 1, 2, or more people. It's important to realize that there's a number and a range of ways that sexual harm, it's not just one particular focus or definition. You pass on to Sharon.
Thank you. This is Sharon. Thank you so much, Jim, for giving us that understanding of what sexual harm is, as we begin again to think about men who've experienced that and what comes up for us as providers. And I want to go back to the chat. There were some wonderful things that were shared when I asked about whether or not our roles change if it's a man who is disclosing. And I think people shared some amazing things. Someone wrote, oh, it's sliding. Our roles don't change, but we might have to. Our role may, in a sense, become even more vital due to stigma surrounding male survivors. The way we see them, hear them, and talk with them. And so I wanted to go back to that because that is really important. Our roles don't actually change. And again, it's us that has to change. Very often I get a question from folks is, why don't survivors disclose? I also learned that if you don't like the question, change the question. A better question to ask is, what is it about us that doesn't allow survivors to disclose? And so we have to really begin to think about what is it about us as providers, societies, and systems that don't give the space for survivors to disclose. Next slide, please. As Ken had mentioned earlier, you probably already are in the know. You already have the skills. They're already you've learned them. They're probably inherent to you. You know how to work with survivors. You know how to work with men who are survivors. It's what might stop us from recognizing the skills that we have also works with men. And very often it's our bias. And so I want to share a quote with you from Zoe Flowers. I attended a training many moons ago about healing informed care for survivors from historically marginalized communities. And she said something so simple yet so profound. She said, survivors don't have barriers. Institutions and systems have barriers. And we as the people responding to survivors have barriers. So again, we have to stop and ask ourselves, what are our bias and what are our barriers? Again, for our purposes in this webinar series is about men. When it's working with men, what comes up for us? Next slide, please. And so it's really important, right? We all have barriers and bias. It's really important, number one, to be graceful with yourself and to spend time acknowledging the barriers that we have, the isms, the phobias that we carry and how they present. Because if we are able to acknowledge and recognize what those barriers are, we are able to dismantle them. If we ignore them, they keep popping up and it makes it difficult for survivors to come forward because again, that's about us. So it is up to us to be aware and to dismantle those barriers to provide appropriate response. I don't want to scare anybody, but the more appropriate your response is to a disclosure of sexual harm, the more likely someone is to seek services in the future. But no pressure. That's why you're here. It's also about supporting the healing process for the individual. That's really important. And to really work towards ending sexual harm. If we allow ourselves to recognize that anyone can experience sexual harm, we then have the ability to recognize that we can also end sexual harm. So actually next slide, and it's actually Ken. I'm going to volley it back to you.
Volley it back to me. All right. So here's a question. So someone comes to you and they tell you they were sexually harmed. They tell you the offender was someone they know. Take a second, mention that we're going to talk a little bit about how it's feeling in the body. So just, if you want to in the chat, describe what's happening in your body just from reading this.
Thank you, Ken. I will actually jump in here.
Yeah.
So again, we've mentioned before, as Ken had talked about, the body is really important. It's really important to pay attention to what comes up for us, more specifically in our body. A lot of bias and barriers will show up in our bodies first. If we put our chins down, we close off our airway, we bring our bodies in, we collapse, all of those things. And so people are mentioning they're holding their breath, feels heavy, tightening in the chest, sweaty palms, heartbreak, stomach is tight. These are all things that are there to protect us and may also be a barrier to being able to respond. So I just wanted to have everyone take a moment, take a breath in, allow the breath to reach into your belly. So put your hand on your belly. Sometimes I imagine I swallow a bowling ball. When it hits my belly, I let it flop and I bring the breath down. And so just take a moment and breathe. And as I read the scenario again, I want you to notice what comes up for you. Continue to breathe in your belly. Someone comes to you and they tell you they were sexually harmed. They tell you the offender was someone they know. Now, I'm just going to ask again for questions of reflection. You do not need to share in the chat. It's just for your own personal reflection in your own head, your own quiet, and hopefully that allows you to be as honest with yourself as possible. When I said someone comes to you and tells you they were sexually harmed, who did you picture? Did you picture a certain form? Was the form a woman or a woman's energy? How did you picture this woman? Who did you picture? Then when someone tells you the offender was someone they know, who did you picture? What if I said to you in this scenario that the someone was a man? How would you then picture that man? And in this scenario, if the survivor was a man, how would you picture the offender? Who would that person be? And I just want you to notice how you understand or experience or see the survivor might change based on the different identities that the survivors are given. And so again, was it even something that people recognize? I know we're talking about men survivors here, but I'm wondering if even we talked about someone being sexually harmed, how many people first jumped to that idea of a woman or a woman's energy? And then thinking about in this scenario, the survivor being a man, how do we then see that man? Very often folks describe the man as being young, right? Or small in stature or other ways. And so again, this just leads us to, again, be aware of the bias that we might have and the assumptions we might make just based on who was presented to us and how presented and the identities that they bring. It's important, again, to recognize that for us so that we can acknowledge what's in the space, push it to the side, but really be thoughtful about using the skills that you're going to be taught in an appropriate way that will facilitate healing. So again, this is just about being aware of the bias that might pop up so you have the opportunity to acknowledge them and to dismantle them.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you, Kelton, for letting me jump in on that.
No problem at all. So to continue with kind of confronting our biases and generalizations, I have a statement here, and I just want you all to add in the chat and finish this sentence. A man is someone who is ... And think about when we think of heteronormative male socialization, what are some of the characteristics that come up? Let me see. Identifying as a man, strong on outside, soft inside. A person, individual, strong, a lot of strong. Told that, all right, he has to be tough, yep. Protective, human, defensive, protector. They're told to be strong. The messaging is all about strength and being a protector. Um, I've heard provider in the past, doesn't want to talk, doesn't want to express themselves. Emotionless is an interesting one. Devoid, removed from our feelings. All right, not supposed to cry, show fit, violent. Those are really interesting ways that we have been socialized. But then we also are protectors. We're violent, but we're protectors according to this heteronormative male socialization. Um, we've all experienced those. So it's important to really identify that and say those things, because then the next question is this. The next sentence is, a victim is someone who is ... Who's a victim? A victim is someone who is resilient, vulnerable, marginalized, overpowered, helpless, vulnerable, trusting. All right. Angry, scared, and confused, isolated, betrayed, harmed. Anyone. It's interesting. Can you be a male and a survivor based on these two culturally defined spaces for men and survivors? We can, right? I think it's important for us to reframe what is for survivors. You can be a man and a survivor. You can be weak and a male survivor. You can be emotional and a male survivor. It's about how do you take vulnerability as a strength, right? Being vulnerable is displaying strength, in my opinion, or resiliency. All of these things that have been, we've been socialized to think about folks, whether they're good or bad, is really important to really start shifting a little bit. So moving forward, take a little time to reflect. No need to share in the chat about this, but how these barriers make it difficult for men to identify themselves as survivors of sexual harm. Remember Sharon's earlier point, survivors don't have boundaries, we do. I'm always thinking about that quote, really powerful for me when I hear it, because I always think, over the years, working in different agencies and spaces, the barriers have always been our processes, our policies, our things. And it's never been the survivors that are coming in. They've never really served as the barrier. So yeah, please definitely take some time to reflect on some barriers about what makes it difficult for men as survivors to come step forward and get help. So let me pass it on. Oh yeah, all right, did this already? And I think, is this Jim or Sharon? Oh, this is me actually.
It is
Sorry,
me.
everyone.
It's me.
That's you? All right.
It is me. So I want everyone again just to take a moment. I know we're giving you a lot of information and it's moving pretty quickly, but I just want to give everyone again a chance to just be present with yourself as much as possible in this moment. Allow the breath to reach the belly. Put your hand on your belly. Allow the warmth to bring that breath down. Or imagine you swallowed a bowling ball and let it hit your belly, let it flop. I just want everyone to be as present as possible as I read the survivor's voice. We have a quote here, and I just think it's, again, important for us to notice what comes up for us. Thoughts, ideas, messages, and what comes up. What is your body doing at this moment? And again, just to have us be aware of bias that might be coming up. So I'm going to read a quote from RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, for Jonathan. When I was raped, I was 6'4" and 220 pounds. I truly believe that I could go anywhere I wanted and no one would bother me. I'm part Samoan, I'm hefty, I wear cowboy boots, and that makes me even taller. I was the defender. Everyone else always said, go with Johnny, you'll be safe with him. I've been told my entire life that it was impossible for this kind of thing to happen to me. Again, just notice as we talk about Jonathan and how he describes his size and who he is. And again, how that sort of changed our thoughts, our ideas, and messages as the quote continued. And again, how it's sitting in our bodies right now. Next slide, please. I know we keep talking about these barriers and bias that we have, and we keep talking about it because it's really important to acknowledge them. So again, that we can dismantle them and make the changes. Like someone said in the chat, we have to change. Because sexual harm is not done in a vacuum. As Kent had mentioned before, rape culture exists. So it's not just about the incidence of sexual harm itself, it's what surrounds it, right? And then what makes it difficult for men to understand themselves as victims and or survivors, and what makes it difficult for them to disclose. And how much of that is coming from us, right? Our conditional learning, the things we're taught about who survivors are. And so again, in order to dismantle it and decondition, which is going to take time and repetition, it's important for us to know what stops men from disclosing. So Ken, if you could continue to click, please. So as I go through these things, I want everyone to go back and remember when we talked about the examples of a victim is, and the idea that men want to maybe avoid seeing themselves as victims because, or survivors, because the two terms didn't come together. They were sort of in competition with each other. And so men stops them from disclosing is they didn't want people to know. Again, it's one thing for me to know. It's very different for someone else to know. Next one, please. Not serious enough to report. You know, I've been working with men for a very long time, and I always joke that I want to have my corner that's my no big deal corner, that have some Band-Aids, some dirt, you know, with the idea of put a Band-Aid on it or rub some dirt on it, right? It's not serious enough to report, but getting men to understand that it is a serious thing. Next one. Very often when I do that exercise around what a victim is, some of the things that come up is the idea of weak. And it's interesting that that's number 3 here. Not that they're necessarily in an order, but they don't want to be men survivors don't want to be seen as weak. Next one. Thought others would blame me. All right. Very often survivors of sexual violence are the ones that hold the blame. And again, we need to change that across the board. But there's many reasons, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, about why others might blame men survivors. Again, it goes back to how we understand men to be and be the protectors and all these things. And again, it doesn't necessarily fit. Next one, please. Didn't think I'd be believed. Remember, I told you before the top 2 reasons survivors don't come forward is not being believed and being judged or blamed. And again, those made this list. And then the next one is felt partially to blame. Next slide, please. And as we move into the next slide, I want us to think about, again, the idea of what a man is, right? And again, those stereotypes of what a man is, and again, how they're contradictory to the idea of what a survivor is. And therefore, men might see it as an attack on their identity as a man and what that means for them, what it means to be a masculine or a man, like I said, in their own experience and identity. So the next one, please. So that might impact how they understand what was done to them and the experience of sexual harm and response to that. So many of them might perceive it as consensual. Men are always supposed to want sex. One of the things that comes up again, when we talk about men, is the idea of being hypersexual. Next one, please. Again, we talked about the idea of controlling and being a protector, all of those things. So men feel as if they should have controlled it. Next one, please. We mentioned before the idea of men survivors and what that means. And we also said that this might include folks with penises as well. And this is sort of where this comes in. The idea of it being perceived as consensual can be misperceived when someone might have, let's say, an erection and or orgasm or have some sort of physical response. And it's just a response. A response or arousal does not mean desire, but that can be very confusing for survivors of sexual violence, no matter who experiences it or when it occurs. And so again, that's a misnomer. There is no sexual pleasure. It's just a body's response. Next one, please. And again, talks about was aroused. And again, arousal does not mean desire. They are 2 different things. But again, this is something that could be very confusing for a survivor and also used against them and can be used as a way to blame them. So I want us all to understand that, again, arousal does not mean desire. It does not mean consent. And the last one, please. should have stopped it and didn't. And again, remembering, and we'll talk about this in future trainings as well, sexual violence is not done in a vacuum, that there were a lot of context around that. And so helping survivors, including men, to understand the context of what was done to them. Again, how being a man is only one part of that experience and one identity, and again, that impacts that experience. And so again, we have to be thoughtful about, for us, how do our bias and barriers feed into these reasons why men do not disclose experiences of sexual harm. And I'm going to pass it off to Kenton.
Thank you, Sharon. So similar to when Sharon was reading her quote, I want you all to take a second when I read this one out. Tap into what's going on in your body when I read this aloud. If you want to put your hand on your belly or get comfortable. While I'm reading this, please just pay attention to your bodies and what's coming up for you. Showing emotion about being abused, it's not well accepted. As a Black man, you've been broken down so much that you have to put on a face of being strong. We have a lot of pain that is unattended to. And it's from Brian. Also, once again, another quote from Rain. So take a second, what comes up for you. If you want to add in the chat, that's great, but it's not a requirement. It's for your personal reflection. And I believe I'm passing it over to Jim.
Yes, thank you, Kenton. It's important at this point that we move and take an kind of a global overview of this issue, because some of the barriers have been baked into our systems and our culture. And it's important, I think, to step back and realize that sometimes the information and the awareness that we have is limited by what we're asking or what we're making available. And for men as survivors, men as experiencing sexual harm, it's relatively within our lifespan for some of us who are older when this is really even being talked about or discussed. Just to add here, not only am I executive director of MenHealing, not only am I been doing this work now for about 45 years, I am a survivor myself. And I did not even come to recognize that or frame it as sexual harm until I was in my mid to late 20s. It was just there, but I didn't have a framing of sexual harm. And I was working with survivors for a number of years before it even occurred to me that that was my experience as well, because all the people I were working with didn't fit my pool of information for how to define it. So that's been so much part of the framework of working with men, boys and men as survivors. I want to use as a reference point the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is where we collect our data. Until 2013, the entire data collection was based on the definition of sexual harm being vaginal penetration. So therefore, the binary of that excluded men and boys. Many state laws did not allow language in the statutes beyond the age of 13 or 14 that even pertained to boys or men. If you want to put up the definition, Kenton, in 2013, the FBI changed their data for collection. That's only 11 years ago. And at this point now, it's penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So now for 11 years, we've been finally collecting official data of things that rape recovery centers were aware of before, that people working in the field were aware of before, but now we're actually collecting data. What's still missing, and what the Center for Disease Control has begun to pick up in some of their data collection of sexual violence is forced to penetrate, being made to force to penetrate, more clearly not defining victim or survivor by gender, including non-consenting experiences, and the use of force or force and threat. These are dynamics that are so often part and parcel of the fabric of how boys and men experience sexual harm. And now, in the recency of the last decade or so, we're now beginning to collect data that validates how much it is an experience for men and boys as well. So the definitions, the framework, the collection has so much to do with what we even see or have. And that's a barrier that we have begun to lessen so we can collect more information and be more effective as providers. Next slide. Richard Gartner, who's one of the pioneers and leaders in working with men and boys as sexual harm, he offers a definition that I think is very worth for us to consider. It consists of any overt and or covert sexual behaviors by which the abuser chooses to take advantage of a power differential with a dependent or vulnerable victim in order to satisfy the abuser's desires and violates the trust the victim has given to the abuser. And just stepping back, I want to tease out that I think a lot of us who are providers are aware of the power differential, but to get down the granular, which we are beginning to start more awareness to factor in, power differential exists in the context of the relationship. It's not based on gender. It's on the context of the relationship. And we need to understand that it might be matters of race, immigration status, financial status, social standing, age. All those kind of factors need to be put in the context of power differential. That's why I think so often we've been limited that we might begin to see that boys can be victims of sexual harm, but our awareness has excluded us to realize that adult males can also be victims of sexual harm. Hopefully we're moving to a place where we're breaking down the gender binary, the biases about power, and the other places that separate and keep us not seeing as clearly as we need to see the reality of men and boys as victims. As we do this, I think it's inevitable that the time frame will change so that boys and men don't have to wait an average of 20 years before they disclose, I too have experienced sexual harm. Let me pass that on to Sharon.
Thank you, Jim. Just a few comments about this definition. I actually use this definition in both my groups with men as well as my individual sessions to help people to understand, again, that context of sexual violence, that it's not just about body parts and actions, right? There's so much more to it. And so I think it's really important, again, to acknowledge there's so many things that can give and take power in a relationship, and gender is just one of them. So being able to sit with a man and sort of understand his different identities and sort of how those identities might give or take power in relationship with others can be very helpful in helping them understand the dynamics. And again, recognizing that sexual violence is not done in a vacuum. Let's move on to the next thing. Speaking of sexual violence being done, we're going to talk about statistics. I'm going to get on my high horse in a second, so I'm just going to warn you. But first, let me read the statistics that are on the slide. Research has identified that at least one of every 4 men or male-identified individuals will experience sexual victimization during their life. So you have come in contact with men who've experienced sexual violence, whether you know it or not. And the prevailing length of time before males disclose being sexually victimized is 20 years. I know it's been talked about very often. If we talk about sexual harm, we open up the discussion, we demystify it, we de-shame it by talking about it. Hopefully that opens up the doors again for men to come and disclose, and hopefully before 20 years occurred. And one of the things I think that will help us to do that is to understand statistics. I very often feel like people use statistics as their way to separate themselves from an experience, particularly one we don't want to acknowledge, such as sexual harm. And later on in the webinar series, as we are going to have survivors speak about their experiences, and it's really hard to separate yourself when you've got faces in front of you of survivors. So that will be occurring later on. I also, as I said, I'm getting on my high horse for a second, have some issues with the idea of statistics. Statistics, particularly around sexual harm, are underreported. And particular populations, the numbers are really, really, really underreported. There's a quote, it's quoted, it's Mark Twain, but it's actually Mark Twain or Benjamin Disraeli. They're both sort of credited with having this quote. There are three types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I like this quote, again, because I work in a field where statistics are underreported. There's a few things that are required in order for the statistics to be accurate. I'm only going to name a few, but there's probably a lot more others, right? So the idea of the person being asked has to recognize what was done to them as sexual harm. And we are talking about men, a population that were never taught that they could be survivors of sexual harm. I'm also thinking about women of color, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, trans folks, populations of folks who are not taught that they could be survivors of sexual harm. So they may not recognize themselves as experiencing sexual harm or being a survivor. That's one. Number two, if survivors are taught that they can't be survivors of sexual harm, so are providers and the rest of us, right? So the idea is that if the interviewer or the person doing the report or the doctor or the provider isn't asking because the person in front of them does not look like what they expect a survivor to look like or be, they may not be asking the question. So not recognizing what was done to them as sexual harm and not being asked if they've experienced sexual harm. And I think number three is the person has to feel safe enough to disclose. Are they in a safe space to disclose? Is disclosing going to make them feel a certain way about themselves? They feel like their identities are going to be attacked. Is it going to impact who they are as a person? I think that is really important. Again, it's only three things, there's many others, but we have to stop and think again about how we can make changes in understanding sexual violence, recognizing it, and hopefully get people to disclose. We want them to disclose to get the support they need. That's the reason for disclosing, right? And so helping folks to recognize, men in particular, because that's what we're talking about, that they can experience sexual harm. Getting folks who work with anyone to ask everyone they work with whether or not they've experienced sexual harm. And three, try to make the space when you're asking a space that feels safe enough. And we're going to talk about safety in another webinar series for the person to disclose and hope that they understand the dynamics of sexual violence so it doesn't feel as if it's an attack to their person. So I'm going to step off my high horse now. And I'm going to pass it to you, Kenton.
All right. I think I'm going to hop on my high horse a little bit here, Sharon, too. So here's some facts. Men and boys are sexually harmed, as we know, right? They are also traumatized by that experience. And we also know trauma responses come out in different ways. And we've expanded our understanding of trauma reactions. And I think that is by doing that, it opens up the possibilities of looking at some of our reactions from our male survivors as, oh, this is a trauma reaction, not just a criminal act or something that's aggressive, right? And honestly, sexual orientation is not determined by sexual harm. And this one, boys and men can be sexually harmed by women and girls, and many are. And there's this amazing, this is my high horse moment, Sharon and Jim, because many times over the years, I've ran groups for young men, and they are describing the first time that they lost their virginity or had some kind of sexual experience, and they're talking about it as they were 11 or 12, and it was an overage person who was clearly taking advantage of them. But the young people are connecting on this rite of passage. It's not a rite of passage, but the world around us has socialized that way because men are supposed to be perceived as sexual beings. And this is something that I am very passionate about, that this has to be shifted, because this is something that distorts how our men perceive their bodies, which then gets in the way of being able to disclose, being able to identify what happened to them, to start healing, right? And simply for being aroused or having a physical reaction that Sharon mentioned earlier is then confused with, oh, you wanted that. This is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. That's what being a man is. You're finally a man. And so these are some facts that I feel are very important to kind of think about. And let's keep going. Also, boys and men are trafficked too. Boys and men are definitely trafficked. I mentioned earlier that arousal ejaculation is just a body response. It's just a body response. It does not mean consent. It doesn't mean anything like that. And just random thing, back in 2008, there was a study by John Jay, College of Criminal Justice here in New York, that found that those who've been sexually exploited, 50% of those victims were boys. Think about that. You don't really think about boys and men are being trafficked. But in 2008, study said, yeah, 50% of those folks that were trafficked that they worked with were men and boys. So I think I am going to pass it over to Jim. Is that Jim or is that? Oh,
Yes,
there you go, Jim.
yes, yeah. We have a couple of minutes here. Let me just add one more expansion on what Ken was just talking about. It's so important that how we're groomed, trained to view sexual harm so much influences what we see or don't see. One pet peeve, my high horse, I guess I need to contribute because both of you had your high horse on that, is the way news media coverage so often frames when the victim is a boy and the offender is a female, it will be approached in the news reports as they had an inappropriate sexual relationship. And we even have mainstream movies that have had the theme of an adult female and a boy as a victim, but it's presented as relational instead of sexual harm. Hopefully we can remove some of those barriers so we'll begin to see more clearly what the experience is when we have the information and the lens to see it through.
Jim, I think it might be important just to look at the chat because I
Yes.
think people are sharing and feeling very validated by what is being shared, particularly around Kenton and the idea of rite of passage and the socialization of men. And I just want to acknowledge that because it's here in this space, right?
Yeah.
We as the providers are here and experiencing these things. So what does that mean for us providing survivors with support and again, what survivors are experiencing? So I wanted to just highlight that. And then folks also wanted to highlight, thank you to those who are doing the research now and who are changing the questions to meet the needs of now and are really trying to bring again the understanding of sexual harm done to men to the forefront. So I want to just highlight those, but most importantly, the idea of the validation that people are experiencing from what's being shared.
And I would like to add a little bit, Jim, I'm sorry, just real quick, just like even the direction, I'm hopeful because of the direction that we're going when it comes to survivors. Maybe 10 years ago, I remember doing work and they would say there was a term, deserving victim. And I'm like, deserving victim, what is that saying? And the profile of someone that would be considered a deserving victim wouldn't fit me or someone else, right? So it's really, I'm really hopeful when it comes to working with survivors. that it's more expansive.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, we need to embrace the positive change that's in motion. Things are changing. State statutes have been modified in terms of how long before someone can report. Data collection is changing. More people are getting trained in their clinical work. There are more resources, more service organizations. Yes, things are changing. We need to embrace that. And then we can be part of the future that we're wanting to all create. And that's changing the experience for boys and men coming forward. So with that in mind, just to bridge before we go into the Q&A, let's use the chat. What are you taking away from today's presentation? Let's put in the chat some just so we can kind of summarize. What are you taking away from the presentation today?
Let's see. Much.
Anything that someone wants to put in the chat?
Yeah.
As a bridge?
Okay, hold on, let me see.
Completely relevant.
Yeah, clarity around statistics.
Let me, I just want to jump in for a second. There's a question about sexual orientation and a link to sexual harm, which we can answer in the Q&A. So I just wanted to highlight that, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah. Awareness to add to the foundation as I currently have. Thank you. Knowledge, validation, reframing sexual violence to sexual harm. The 20 years average statistics. Important for male survivors to tell their stories. Yes, MenHealing, we are very much focused on storytelling, not just statistics. Need to broaden our own lens, verbiage, newfound respect for this work and newfound responsibility.
How to better understand personal bias, cultural changes needed, and how to listen and hear people better.
Emily, about shouting into the void. Hopefully this is helpful for you so you don't feel like you're just shouting into the void.
Yes. Term sexual harm. What you do the next slide, Kenton, and as people are doing, we can summarize what we're hoping are your takeaways from today, which fits what people are putting in the chat. Someone here is saying that it was 50 plus years. In our weekends of recovery, we have had a number of people who have come to us in their later senior years before they first had the opportunity to start in their late 60s, 70s. So 20 years is the average, but it's clear that a lot of people have had to wait longer before they worked with it. Just summarizing the three primary takeaways that we hope that you are gathering from this today, and we'll build on these in the subsequent sessions that we're going to do for the next 6 months. Men and boys are victims of sexual harm. As responders, we have barriers to men disclosing and seeking help. We have to be active in acknowledging and dismantling these barriers, which we're suggesting is happening, and we're living with the results of those changes. And create space where men can feel comfortable. It's very important that maybe just as a standard practice, whether you're an interviewer, an advocate, a clinician, we always ask someone at the point of contact, what do you need to be safe enough to tell me what happened to you? Yeah. What do you need to be safe enough to tell me what has been your experience of what happened to you? Thank you.
Next slide, Jim.
So we're right at, let me just leave you one final slide, and there'll be things in the slides that you get. Here's the websites to our respective organizations. We each have a lot of resources. MenHealing, we have a lot of videos of men telling their stories of hope and healing, the recovery process. Visit our websites. And we hope that we're part of a larger movement to create safe spaces for boys and men to get the services that they need. There's also a couple of slides of references for things that we've talked about today that you can refer to back to find more information. Yeah. And NSVRC has a lot of resources as well, so we need to note that. So let me turn it over to Louis, and you can help field the Q&A part of the time that we have left here today. And thank you so much to all of you who are here, and we want to hear your voice for things you'd like to know more about today.
Jim, do you mind if we just go back to that question? Because we're getting questions in the chat about that. And maybe you want to address, I know this is something you talk often about, is there a connection between sexual orientation and sexual harm? And how might men survivors experience or understand sexual orientation and sexual harm?
Again, this goes back to where it's the context of power violation and betrayal. And I don't think it should be defined by gender or sexual orientation. But that has been a stereotype that has been within the fabric of our culture that we're beginning to dismantle, is that gay people are synonymous with offenders. Gay people have been linked with child predatory behavior. And because same-sex interactions have been illegal, criminalized, etc., it all kind of gets mixed and matched. But if you take it where it's okay to be gay, it's okay to be straight, it's okay to be bi, it's okay to be whatever, all that begins to fall by the wayside. And sexual harm for men and boys is not about sexual orientation. It's about non-consent, betrayal, violation of power. That's kind of the simple way to take it out of that phrase. But the culture and a lot of the systems that collect data, a lot of the providing, right, has been trapped with that lens of seeing all the invisibility and biases of both issues, and they get linked together. And I hope that we can be active at separating them and realizing it's about respecting people's ability to be consenting.
And I think just to summarize, because someone had also brought something up in the chat, is the idea that sexual violence, sexual harm is about power and control. It's not about arousal. It's not about desire, like very quickly saying that. And if you stop and think for a second, if you think about power dynamics, right? When it comes to wanting to gain ultimate power, would you sexually harm a man or a woman? You would sexually harm a man because in society, in the dynamics, men have more power. And so hopefully that helps you understand, again, it's not about desire and sex. It is about power. And to harm men can make that person feel more powerful. To break it down by that, I will say that a lot of men survivors will question and wonder whether or not their orientation is in response to their sexual harm. It's just about having that conversation, helping them to understand that, but being very open to having that conversation with them. Again, it's just one thing that they wonder and question, and that's absolutely okay. And if someone decides that that's the reason for them, that's the reason for them, and to let them have that experience and that consent.
Yes,
absolutely.
And I do want to acknowledge, there's a comment in the chat that I agree, it is important to acknowledge, because we are in a culture when people act out some of their biases, act out some of their violent tendencies, so to speak, the prevalence of hate crimes, of victimization, of harm for gays and transgender is much higher in their culture. So that is a risk factor. So often violence against a gay person is sexual violence.
And that exact thing we're talking about is one of those barriers that allow LGBTQ folks to come forward.
Yes.
Is those bias and misunderstandings.
Absolutely. All right.
Louis, do you have any questions in the Q&A note that you want to pose to us for?
Sure, we have a couple. Thank you all, and thanks everyone for your great participation in the chat. There was one comment I wanted to highlight. Emma was wanting to give credit to the wonderful researchers who are working to deal with some of these issues that have historically existed. So thanks for shouting out that some researchers are understanding this and adjusting questions, for example, so that someone doesn't need to identify as a survivor in order to answer them. And somebody asked about getting a copy of the PowerPoint and about recording. Yes, again, all of these sessions will be recorded and posted on nsvrc.org. There is one question I will pose to the panel, but just quickly, one that I can answer very quickly. Ivy asked if the 20-year reporting statistic for men, which was from 2013, asking about more recent stats. I want to give a shout out to the NSVRC library team. We have a great team that can help it dig into any kind of research questions like this that you have. So you could email us at resources@nsvrc-respecttogether.org, and we can make sure that any of your research related questions get to those folks. And Sarah, could you type that email address in the chat as I'm fielding the other question, the resources one? I also do see the comments about the survey link, and we'll get working on that. The question that I want to pose to our presenters from the Q&A is, please tell me any books and links by which male survivors of sexual abuse can learn how they can start their own peer support group of male survivors. So it's kind of a specific ask. So maybe you could think broadly about books and links that male survivors of sexual abuse can use.
I can start by saying to bring people to BARC's website that I know BARC specifically has resources, links, as well as books, and a link with Amazon to purchase any books that would be helpful for survivors, including men survivors and you as providers. So I just want to draw your attention to BARC's website that also has a plethora of other types of resources for you. So I just wanted to bring people's attention to that.
I can add the MenHealing website, a couple of things that may be helpful. If you go to our menu bar on resources, we have links to other organizations that are working surrounding these kinds of issues. And we have a publications page. And on the publications page, we have listing anybody affiliated with MenHealing, descriptions and links to books they may have published that would give people resources. And for some of us who have chapters in edited books, we have secured permission for PDF free downloads of those chapters. So there are a number of those chapters that may be very helpful. We have one chapter that's free download about our weekends of recovery, how we organize those. So I encourage you to go and check out those resources. And secondly, if you go to our MenHealing website and our support groups project, which we're just reconfiguring, we'll have some new information up really soon. We offer a smorgasbord of support groups, groups for men who have been to one of our weekends of recovery. We have 15-session support groups, all virtual access. We are starting community support groups for men who have not had the opportunity to come to a weekend. And we're going to be starting partner groups. And what we're probably going to be adding based on a discussion we've just had is a resource if you want to start your own group and you'd like to get some consultation and support, you can sign up to get on a wait list for that kind of help with starting your own peer kinds of support groups. So check that on our website. We're actively trying to spread the availability of people finding peer groups to be part of.
And I would add, if anyone on this, as part of their agency, wants to start men's groups or just wants to talk more about it, is that MenHealing and myself at BARC are available also to provide consultation around groups and curriculums and just things to think about, as we do want to, again, increase everyone's resources, as well as just provide just a community around this issue.
Yeah. To the earlier point, this is part of a movement. So we definitely want to make sure that we are in collaboration with you all. There's about 100 something people here, 125 people still here. There's a lot of opportunities for us to collaborate and build with each other.
I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I do see a request in the chat for Sharon's contact information. But I'll pause. Oh, someone said thank you for answering my questions. So someone else said thank you all, looking forward to the next session. So I'll pass it back to you all, Jim, Kenton, and Sharon, if you want to offer any closing thoughts. But I say if there's no other questions, we're able to end a little bit before 1:30 Eastern. Any final thoughts?
I'm just thankful for everybody being here, and I'm just amazed at what people shared in the chat.
Yes.
I love it. I love it. I love it. And I can't wait to do the next one.
Same here. Super excited about the energy in this space together, and I'm really looking forward to this whole series. And tell your friends about this. We want this to be a movement, and more people here. So thank you all.
Kind of dovetailing on what Kenton and Sharon were just saying, we all, as people who are interested in this issue, who work in this field, we have the same barrier of feeling isolated and invisible. We're doing this work, and it's so reaffirming to have this many people show up to share time together to work on this, because we're building a movement as well, a movement of people who care about this issue, a movement of people who are providing high quality services about this issue. And so I hope we all embrace whatever's been the history and what precedes us. We are now becoming a movement, and let's empower ourselves and continue that forward, because there are lots of people who we're bringing into the movement so that we don't feel the same kind of isolation and invisibility that we've been feeling for so long. So thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. Go ahead.
Someone asked, can they jump in on the next session of the series? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Alexis, if you mean if participants can verbally participate, I'm not sure. We're using the webinar for a new person to join. Yes, yes, thank you for saying that. Okay, Alexis is asking if a new person can join the next session. Yes, I do. I want to make sure this is very clear. Nobody needs to have come to the earlier sessions to come to the later ones. People can still sign up using the same link that you all used. You all registered for a series, not just one session. So it's the same link, and we're going to do our best to get these recordings posted as soon as possible, so people can hopefully have time to watch them before the next one, if that's something that they want to do. So thank you for asking that. And yeah, I just want to say there's a pretty big team behind the scenes working today to make this session happen. So in addition to our three presenters, I want to thank all of our ASL and Spanish interpreters, our live captioner, and everyone from the NSVRC team who's recording and helping in the chat and things like that. So thanks so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next month. You have my contact information from the registration. If you have any questions in the meantime about this topic, we're here to answer those questions or find someone who the best person is to answer them. And yeah, stay in touch with our project. We've got a lot of other stuff coming up, including a webinar that's not part of this series on working with incarcerated trans men coming up at the end of this month. So thanks for being here, and have a great day.